Did you know the United States has the highest prison and jail population as well as the highest incarceration rate in the world? We'll discuss this and other interesting facts about the criminal justice system and mass incarceration with essayist and podcaster Wayne Boatwright on this episode of The Curious Professor. Hi everyone, I'm Dr. B. Welcome to the Curious Professor podcast, where I take listeners on a journey of discovery to explore the people, places, artifacts, and natural wonders that spark my curiosity. On this episode of the Curious Professor podcast, we'll explore the complexities of the criminal justice system, reentry, and the power of redemption with essayist and podcaster Wayne Boatwright. But first, a trivia question. Why is the rooster used as a symbol in the branding of sriracha sauce? I'll have the answer for you at the end of this episode. I'm thrilled to have Wayne Boatwright on the show today. Wayne is an Ivy League educated attorney and polymath, making waves in law, journalism, and advocacy. Beyond advising multinational corporations in Asia and Silicon Valley startups, Wayne's journey took an unusual turn with 6 years at San Quentin for gross negligent vehicular manslaughter. His role as managing editor for the San Quentin News deeply influenced his views on the criminal justice system, fueling his advocacy on mass incarceration, reentry, addiction, and parenting through adversity. Wayne holds a JD from Cornell Law School and a BA in economics from Brigham Young University. Wayne's essays, podcasts, and advocacy spotlight the need for contemplation in an era of rapid information consumption. His unique perspective, shaped by personal adversity and professional excellence, makes him a compelling voice to explore the complexities of the criminal justice system, reentry, and the power of redemption. Welcome to the show, Wayne. It's great to have you here.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here.
What is the most unique thing about you?
Probably that I've led many lives, kind of like a cat. I've probably had about 9 lives. I'm currently 61, for example. But I've done such an amazing range of different things. I kind of look at life as life doesn't happen to you, life happens for you. So I consider all of them learning experiences. Some experiences I never dreamed I would have to learn.
So you've stated that the what of your crime was driving drunk and committing gross negligent vehicular manslaughter. The how was that you thought it acceptable to take such risks. And the why you've spent long hours, weeks, years discovering. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
My ideas for me are kind of like chandeliers, and going around and lighting all those candles can take time. So I apologize if this seems a bit far afield, but it's the way I think. It's through long observation, not just of myself, but all the others that I've dealt with in the different rehabilitation groups that I participated in. I've come to realize that all of us as children have a myriad of traumatic events that happen to us. But trauma is not those events. Trauma is how we respond to those events. And in my case, I was raised by a single mother who didn't have a high school education. And therefore, my response to the challenges I had as a child was to create a very central identity of pride. And it's the opposite of pride, of course. I felt that I had shortcomings, so I had to be better, faster, and stronger. And that better, faster, stronger mantra suited me very well through most of my life. Not only was I raised by a single mother with a half-brother in rent control housing, receiving government aid. I had food stamps back in the day, all of that stuff. But I was better, faster, stronger, and was able to go to a junior college and go to a college and ultimately go to Cornell Law School and become a lawyer. And so I consider that a real testament to the effectiveness of this tool, better, faster, stronger. But it was a tool I developed as a child, and it didn't suit me well as an adult. And when I faced personal challenges in my late 40s, I began to rely upon alcohol as as a coping mechanism for the stresses that I was experiencing, because I couldn't be better, faster, stronger with the skill set that I had to deal with those challenges. And my pride wouldn't allow me to ask for help. I couldn't even ask my wife for help, but I could ask the bottle to help me cope with that pain. And then I had a traumatic event with my family. My mother had fallen down some stairs and was in hospice, and so I had to deal with her and my special needs brother and get them into an assisted living facility. And they were down in LA, so I was taking every 3 weeks. I was driving down to LA for a week to deal with that over a 6-month period. And my coping mechanism was more and more alcohol. Now, I didn't realize at the time I was an alcoholic. I knew I had bad days, don't get me wrong, but I didn't face the risks that I was taking, and my pride wouldn't let me admit them either. And so I was driving while intoxicated, coming back from LA, going home to San Francisco, and I was so drunk that I was driving the wrong way on a freeway, and I had a head-on collision, and I took a life with my crime. And crime it is, right? But I wasn't able, I didn't have the tools at the time to recognize it or to deal with it, whether it be my alcoholism or my pride. And the result is somebody else had to pay a terrible penalty. In fact, I would contend that 2 families were destroyed by my crime, both that of my victim and my own family, because their expectations of me as a husband and a father were also destroyed by my actions. And learning to face that is a solitary, difficult journey. And I did that while I was in the walls of San Quentin State Prison on what is called the main line. So I wasn't in a protective custody format. I was with all the drug dealers, the murderers, the pimps, everything you'd imagine. But that was the best way I knew to try to gain the skills I needed to understand how I could be that person, how I could be someone that could be so proudful and so reliant on alcohol that I could take a life. Because I had to make sure I could never do something like that again. I owed it to my victim's family. I owed it to my family. I owed it to my community and society to learn those things. And so I took that very seriously. But the way I did that was through volunteer groups. Unfortunately, most prisons don't offer the vast variety that I had access to at San Quentin. San Quentin is kind of like the Silicon Valley of criminal justice reform. It has over 100 different groups come in. There's all kinds of different organizations who volunteer that you can participate in if you voluntarily choose to. And I took full advantage of that when I was in San Quentin. I'm not sure if that answers your whole question, but I kind of get you to how I got there, if it does.
You're a published essayist, and in one of your essays, you call prison a ghetto of the soul. Can you tell us what you mean by that?
By its very nature, it's an isolating experience. You're meant to be segregated from society in every way. There's no internet in a prison. Phone calls have to be scheduled in advance, and they're limited to 15 minutes, and they're listened to by custody and control. Even worse, to be honest, it's like 1980s. There's a bank of 4 phones, and you go up and you put in your information to make your call. There's a sign there that says, please keep your hands out of your pants. So which should give you an idea of some of the other conversations that occur. Not that I would know, because I come from the atheist, elite, educated community, and so I won't listen to somebody else's call. But the mass majority of the guys in prison haven't been able to integrate into mainstream society. They listen to everything you say. And they come from a competitive culture of scarcity. So they will use anything they can do for their own advantage. That's just their nature. That's the culture that they grew up in. It is the way they see the world. And so you have to be very circumspect in what you say on the phone. So try to imagine when I'm trying to speak with my 10-year-old daughter about her favorite books, for example, on that phone. It can happen, but there are limits to what I can say. And that's a difficult environment to operate in. It is a ghetto. If anything, I would contend I was like a ghost to my community. I would appear out of nowhere. I'd make this strange call to them. They didn't know it was coming. And they could choose to accept that or not if they wanted to. But they didn't know what to do with me. My community had no exposure to the criminal justice system beyond what they saw on TV, basically. And therefore, they were hesitant on how to deal with me. and how to speak with me. And I've actually found that that is the exact same thing since I've come home. I still feel like a ghost to my former community, the vast majority of it.
This goes into the next question. I think you talked about this a little bit, but you discussed the losses of self in prison. Is there any more that you wanted to say about that?
Well, in my case, I recognized that there were depths of the unconscious or subconscious existence that I had to access if I wanted to make the changes that I knew I needed to make to not be a risk to others with my addiction. And in order to do that, you have to use, it's not a literate part of yourself. It's a visual and a storytelling part of yourself. And so you have to create very rich visuals with a lot of retrieval cues in order to access that part. In my case, the way I like to visualize it is I say I burned down the psychic delusion house that I had built up over my life by my experience, by my education, by my religion, by my culture that I lived in my whole life. And I made the determination while I was in prison that I was going to rebuild that psychic delusion house from the very beginning. And it's led me to a new mantra, which is I refuse to know for certain what everybody takes for granted in our society. And I mean everything I will look at with new eyes. And so I made it my mission to do that, not just with groups, but with an amazing amount of reading. I was very lucky to have a library in San Quentin that gave me access to an amazing range of philosophers and thinkers across the time. I like to say that I've learned to rely upon ancient Greeks and dead Englishmen for much of this new psychic delusion house I have rebuilt, but also neurobiology and the social sciences as we've gained to understand them over time. The concept of ACE, which is adverse childhood experiences, and how those, as those multiply, the impacts those have. Big data mindsets. I did a lot of, so my attorney background wasn't as what you see on TV. I wasn't a litigator or a criminal lawyer. I was a business lawyer. And I worked mainly with corporations, big corporations to begin with, then at Accenture in a global position. But then I worked mainly with startups in Silicon Valley for over a decade. And so I loved their creativity and their willingness to challenge societal norms, whether it be economically or in other ways. And so I took that to heart. And so I decided to teach myself in these ways. So yeah, I burned down my psychic delusion house and I've worked very hard to rebuild it. And much to my surprise, the world is a very different place than I imagined it was before.
It's almost like you recreated yourself as a startup.
Yeah.
A new personality, a new existence for yourself.
Yeah, I haven't done this in the past, but I'm going to beg your indulgence to give you a quick quote of an example of that. So in Hobbes and Leviathan, he wrote, by this it appears how necessary it is for any man that aspires to true knowledge to examine the definitions of former authors and either to correct them where they are negligently set down or to make them for himself. For the errors of definitions multiply themselves accordingly as the reckoning proceeds and lead men into absurdities, which at last they see, but cannot avoid without reckoning anew from the beginning. That hit me very hard. That is the journey that I have decided to take, regardless of the cost. And I have to tell you, I feel it's made me a hard man in many ways. Not a cruel man, I don't think, but a hard man as I look at the absurdities I see in our modern society, and I'm willing to call them out.
And you're doing that with your essays and your appearances on podcasts and all the work that you're doing currently.
Well, those are two of the ways that I've the podcasts and the writings are very personal for me. I consider it a form of creative self-expression. One of the things I learned is you have to have introspection so you understand yourself and the journey you've been on, and the scars that you have. Respect the scars. Again, life is for us, not to us. But don't let them stay an open wound. Don't get me wrong. But the next stage, once you do introspection, is also to do creative self-expression. And whether that be in sports or in the arts or in writing or in whatever way you decide you want to express yourself to society, it could be your career, then do it. But the next level is one of service. The two we just talked about, the writings and the podcasts, kind of meld both of the last two, right? They show my self-expression by creating my self-realization and introspection through creative self-expression and through service. I'm also on the board of a nonprofit called Man to Man, which has as its mission to teach fatherhood values mainly to inner city youth and men in prison. The vast majority of which, by the way, never had a father in the home and therefore don't have best practices, as we would say in consultant speak, on how to be a father, on how to use nonviolent communications, on how to lead their children by example. And so on that group, as a member of the board, I've worked very hard to promote Man to Man and its mission and the educational programs that it produces so that men can gain the tools that they have no idea. Many of them have no idea they don't have them. They can't comprehend it, but they need them. Because unfortunately, I've discovered through my time in prison that this becomes a multi-generational issue. I knew one family that had 3 generations in San Quentin, the grandfather, father, and son. And many of the people who are in prison have a similar experience, either with siblings or cousins or parents. And so we have to break that cycle. And one way is to teach good fatherhood values. Another organization I'm involved in is called Braver Angels. And I'm on the National Debate Committee for Braver Angels. And we seek to create a forum for people to have civil political discourse about issues that they may disagree with. And in the past year, we've talked about election security. We've talked about abortion. We've talked about the rise of disinformation and its distribution, and how do we counteract that? So I consider that another organization that I like to be involved in, a form of my service, both of those. And I've been the managing editor for the San Quentin News. And if I have one pitch to make on our call, it would be that all of our listeners who are curious about what's possible in the criminal justice reform effort and to understand how people can be rehabilitated, they should read the San Quentin News. It's sanquentinnews.com, publishes 40 to 60 articles a month about the criminal justice efforts that are being done, again, mainly by volunteers, not mandated by the state within the prison system, both local, state, national, and globally, of what's possible. So it's a great resource if people are curious about this topic, sanquentinnews.com.
That leads us into the next question, which was about the Victim Offender Education Group. And you talk about being a member of that group. And how did that impact you? And what role do you see it playing as a component of restorative justice?
Great question. Yeah. Restorative justice gives us a lot of hope to make progress in our criminal justice reform efforts and in our justice system. But in many ways, it's underappreciated. For example, the Victim Offender Education Group, or VOGUE, was a small group format. We had 8 inmates, an inmate facilitator, and then 2 outside counselors that would sit in a circle. And to talk to your subconscious mind, that circle is important. You can't hide in a circle. You're all there. And other people can see the blind spots that you cannot because of the defense mechanisms you've created to protect yourself from whatever traumatic experiences you may have had. And so you don't even know things. Other people might clearly see what some of these issues are, but they can't tell you that. I think one of the, you're a curious professor, and I think one of the challenges I see in our educational system is that it focuses on reminder over true learning and being able to do far learning, far application of concepts as you learn them rather than just rote memorization. And there needs to be a lot more of that. In order for us to learn things, we have to do it ourselves. So I would tutor math in prison. Math is a bigger impediment than reading, believe it or not, for many of these guys. And they would always ask me to check their work and tell them if they got the answer right. And I would always say, no, I'll teach you how to check your work because you have to find the answer in your head, not in my head. That just shows me that you might have by rote learned how to get the answer. It doesn't show me you understand anything. They hated that. They just wanted to be told they were right and they were good. It's like, no, I'm not going to play that game. And I think Vogue was very similar to that. You had to find this was an inner journey that you go through. And I have to tell you, it was 18 months. It culminated in a panel of families of victims who had lost somebody to a criminal act, where you would be the person in the black hat that would show up at that panel and sit down and hear their pain and let them explain the trauma that they had gone through and where they were currently at. But the goal was to help all of us, perpetrator and victim, learn to become a survivor. Again, the scar, be proud of the scar. That's part of your journey. I mean, how else can you know who you are without challenges in life? It's not a challenge you want to have. I'm not saying that. But if others can learn from our conversation, for example, how to deal with addiction or coping mechanisms that are unhealthy, like violence could be a coping mechanism, for example, not just drugs and alcohol, then great. Learn from my experience so you don't have to go through it yourself, please. And Vogue allowed us to do that. I stay in touch with the counselors who ran my group. One of them is a wonderful old lady. Her name's Bonnie. She's 79 years old. We had lunch 2 months ago, and I've been home for 4 years. I love Bonnie. Bonnie loves me. You know, we went through this journey together, and I respect her for taking the time to sit with me through that 18 months of regular coursework and sessions and everything in a victim panel, because she's part of my journey. I will always be grateful. She tried to buy me lunch, believe it or not. And I was like, Bonnie, there's no way you are paying for lunch ever when you're with me. You've done so much for me. So yeah, Vogue was a great group. And I think the format of nonviolent communications, a circle, a small group, long form, long time meeting is invaluable to people who want to gain access to their own foundational beliefs and values that they may not even realize they believe because they've held them for so long. If people are curious about this issue, because what Vogue does is it teaches you to take responsibility for your crime and the consequences of it for your victim, for their family, for their community, for society, for your family, for your community, all the consequences that many people aren't cognizant of when they're out committing their crimes at all. But it also teaches you to learn to forgive yourself for what you've done and learn to accept that one act doesn't define your life and that you have a chance to be more than that if you are willing to learn to do that. The way I like to characterize it, and what I think is one of the main things I gained from my experience at Vogue, is many people who have addictions, and they could be any sort of addiction. Read Gabor Mate if you want to get a definition of this. He's a great, he and Bonnie worked together. So that's how I learned about Gabor Mate and love this guy. His books, please listen to his podcast. You'll get a good insight into addiction and how to deal with it. But in essence, the way I like to characterize it is that coping mechanism is triggered by some event in your past. The defense mechanism you build up is a trigger. And I find that many people who have addictions and many of the groups that try to help people with addictions are building a wall around the trigger so that you can't trigger it. And we're almost always smart enough to get around that wall, to get over that wall, to get through that wall. I think Matthew Perry, the TV star who recently passed away, is a classic example of somebody who had built a wall, had been trained to build a wall, had gone to great lengths to build a wall around his trigger, when he should have been taught to dismantle the trigger so that it wasn't an issue. I've been home 4 years. I consider take my sobriety very seriously. I have not had an issue with a desire to drink. And I've worked in a restaurant with 2 bars, and I was offered drinks regularly. It hasn't been an issue for me. I've dismantled that trigger. I don't need alcohol as a coping mechanism anymore. And I'm afraid that many of the people and many of the mental health professionals, unfortunately, work to build a wall around that trigger rather than helping people dismantle it.
You stated that your children doubled in age while you were in prison. How did your incarceration impact them, and how did it impact your relationship with them?
You know, a relationship is like a tapestry that we weave together with multiple different threads. And I rent that tapestry. I didn't burn it like I did my psychic delusion house, I don't think. But it's had a myriad of impacts on my children. To date, 4 years since I've been back, it has been the most challenging with my daughter. But during my time in prison, there was 18 months where my son wouldn't visit me in prison because he said he was angry. But of course, he wasn't really angry by what I had done. And the fact that his supposed friends in school would tease him about his father. But he was hurt, and he didn't know how to, his developmental level wouldn't allow him to understand that much better than I'm angry. And so I had to be patient for 18 months. But, my Alice Miller is a great author, a Swiss psychologist who I deeply admire. One of her books is called The Drama of the Gifted Child, and seminal work as far as I'm concerned. She deals with how the body keeps the score, how you internalize these things, and it's amazing what she's written about. But I think she gave me insight that as a parent, it's my role to be an enlightened witness to my children's lives. And that's a permanent role. You don't stop being an enlightened witness for them. And so I did my best to be the best example I could be to my children, even though I was incarcerated and they didn't see me very often. I think, another element of my burning down my psychic delusion house was a few months into my sentence, my wife of 14 years and mother of my 2 children told me she wanted a divorce. That burned down as much of my psychic delusion house as my crime did, to be honest. But to her eternal credit, she continued to bring my children to visit me in San Quentin, regardless of the challenges that was, the whole time I was there. And I will forever be grateful to her for that gift and her willingness not to vilify me to my children. And then my job was to be that enlightened witness to them and to be able to talk with them and find ways to meet them where they were. I mentioned talking on the phone with my daughter. She was a big Rick Riordan fan who wrote all the books about, the Greek gods and the Roman versions of them and the Aztecs and the Egyptian gods, all of the Nordic gods, talked about all of them, right? Starting with Percy Jackson and the Lightning Thief. She loved those books. So as an enlightened witness, I took it upon myself to go to the prison library and read every Rick Riordan book I could find because I needed to meet her where she was. And so by bringing up examples from those books of the characters that she had fallen in love with in those books, I was able to show her that I understood her and I knew where she was at. And then I could use that opportunity to extend that understanding. She wasn't really an orphan, even though her father was gone for a number of years. And because they were so heavily focused on the Greeks, I told her I was like Odysseus, that had this long journey of misadventure coming home, but I was going to come home even if people didn't recognize me. And I try to plant those seeds, and that's what they are. These seeds don't have to be fully blossomed as soon as you plant them. There may be resistance to them. My son, again, didn't visit me for 18 months, but now we communicate daily, even though he's a sophomore at college back on the East Coast. And we have the most amazing relationship I could have ever imagined with each other. And I use baseball with him, by the way, talking about meeting where they are. He's a big baseball fan. And I feel blessed that when he was a senior in high school, I was able to travel to his high school. He goes to school back east as well, back in Connecticut. And I got to watch him play baseball for a week, the practices and the games, because one of the saddest events for him, what he wrote about in his college essays when he was applying for college, was how he dreamed that his dad could watch him play baseball, and I was never able to. And so I was able to give him that gift and be an enlightened witness to him playing baseball and cheer him on, right? And his teammates. That is something I've been able to do since I've been home. But in prison, it was very difficult. I'd try to write letters. I'd have these short phone calls. But the most valuable tool, thanks to my ex-wife, was that she brought those kids to visit me. They have to see you. They have to be with you. You have to play a game of Uno together. You have to share a meal together. These things are essential for your relationships. And I think I fear in the modern era, so many people are caught up in the digital realm that they don't realize how little time. Oh, I was home with the kid all weekend. It's like, were you? Were you home, or were you in the digital realm? Or were they in the digital realm? Those are concerns I have since I've come home, as I've realized how our society has changed dramatically in between the time I went to prison and when I came back. I had a BlackBerry phone when I went to prison, for heaven's sakes. The world has changed, and we need to acknowledge that fact. But meet the kids where they are and be an enlightened witness to their lives. Be their front row. Cheer them on in everything they do. Don't tell them what to do. Don't try to make them live the life you wish you had led. That's their choice. But be that enlightened witness. And I think Alice Miller expresses that the best that I've found as an author.
You have a video series of prison life tips, and one of these tips is sriracha sauce. Why is that so valuable in prison?
Yes, I try to give tips. I've had 26 jobs in the 4 years since I've come home. I'm disbarred as an attorney. I haven't been able to get a management role because I think people rightfully are questioned whether I'm trustworthy given my prior alcoholism and crime. And so I do just about everything work-wise. And one of those jobs was with a group called Prison Professors, where we try to prepare people for those who know they're going to go to prison and how do they get ready. And so I made that series of short videos to try to get guys ready. And sriracha sauce is an essential condiment. Prison, the number of people who get type 2 diabetes in prison is well beyond societal norms. And the diet is so carb heavy, bread, beans, rice, pasta, that it's perfectly natural for type 2 diabetes to be a problem. But the food is so bland and boring and awful. Sriracha is a gift from God to any inmate. And if you go to prison and you have a chance to order what's called a quarterly package, which is once every 3 months you're able to order items out of a catalog, I recommend anybody to get a bottle of sriracha and be willing to share it with others, and they will instantly have the respect of their community. Yeah, sriracha is essential. Again, I come from the educated elite atheist community. I was advised to take steroids, get muscles, and shave my head so I could be tough in prison. I didn't take that advice, but I stayed safe in prison. And I did that by being valuable and a contributing member to my community. So when these guys would order, Hershey's chocolate from their quarterly package, I would order Nutella because I knew what it was. You want to earn a lifelong friend in prison? Take a guy who's been in prison his whole adult life and introduce him to Nutella. Trust me, he will forever be grateful to you. But I provided value that way. And by the way, it was always a trade in some form. You never give people anything in prison. They have to earn it. For me, you mentioned sriracha. I imagine I mentioned this on one of those podcasts. When I went home from prison, you get up very early. You get up like 4:30 in the morning, and they take you out at like 5. And when I got up early, it was time for me to take the stuff I would take, which was very little. And I'd given away most of my stuff to other inmates. But I had to throw away over 1,000 packets of lemon Kool-Aid that I had collected over my 6 years in prison. And you get Kool-Aid in your lunch. And by the way, you need it. It has vitamin C and vitamin D. You spend most of your time inside. You need the vitamin D. You should drink that Kool-Aid if you're in prison. But what I would do to both establish a relationship and establish trust was trade something from my lunch that they wanted. My cookies, my bread, my cheese, whatever it might have been. And I would say, but you've got to have lemon Kool-Aid. I wouldn't say every Kool-Aid. That's too obvious. Nope, you got lemon Kool-Aid, I'll trade with you. So that trading mindset, that barter mindset is mutual respect. And so as long as you can establish that mutual respect, you'll be safe in prison without having to become a member of the Aryan Brotherhood if you're white, or a member of the Norteños if you're Latino in the gang structure. And so that worked for me. Yeah, sriracha's key. Nutella, great idea. And learn to trade. Be of value to your community, but make sure it's never give anything. I saw many guys who were basically just an ATM machine to the other inmates because they would give things away. And that snowballs. And more people expect you to give them things. And it's just not healthy. And you're not treating them like adults when you do that. You're treating them like children. Trade. Earn respect, but give respect as well. And that worked for me.
And is there anything else you'd like to tell us about you or your work?
I think one of the greatest satisfactions for me is that I've been able to contemplate and deeply study things, both in prison and since I've come home. And I've recognized a lot of things that were very different than I had originally imagined. And I try to express those in the different pieces that I write about. I talk about Vogue in a piece called The Circle. I talk about burning down my psychic delusion house. I write a letter to a younger self about the things I wish I had known when I was younger. I talk about the concept of the danger of the defense mechanisms we created as children to protect us that are no longer beneficial to us as adults. And how do we dismantle those defense mechanisms that could lead us into folly as we mature? But I also talk about things like should transgender athletes be allowed to compete in college events? And I talk about election security. And I try to do that with the same mindset I brought to reestablishing my whole life. I go back to basic principles and relook at these things. And I think people would find if they take a time to read any of these, they'll be very surprised at some of the conclusions I reach, whether it's about immigration, a woman's right to choose. All of these things are discussed, and I'm very proud of them. And I would hope people would find value in them because it's one of the ways that I try to be creatively self-expressed and contribute to our society, as with Man to Man, as with Brazier Angels, as with the San Quentin News, for example. My Substack, hopefully you'll put the link on. I'd love them to look at some of my stuff on Substack. Again, it's all free, guys. You can find it there. There's well over 100 postings of these variety of topics that I've written about.
Yes, I will definitely put a link to your Substack in the show notes. And it was wonderful to have you on the show, Wayne. Thank you so much for taking time to be a guest on the Curious Professor podcast.
Karen, you're amazing. Thank you so much for being a curious professor and not just trying to teach everybody else. I love it. You brought out some great things, and I've really enjoyed our time together.
Awesome. Thanks for being here. And now for the answer to this episode's trivia question. Why is the rooster used as a symbol in the branding of sriracha sauce? The rooster is used as a symbol for sriracha sauce because the company's founder, David Tran, a refugee from Vietnam, was born in the year of the rooster. We'll end the show with something punny. What do you call hot sauce wearing a coat? A chili pepper. Thank you for joining me for this episode of the Curious Professor podcast. If there's a person, place, artifact, or natural wonder that has sparked your curiosity and you'd like for me to feature it on the show, please let me know. My website is thecuriousprofessorpodcast.com. If you enjoyed the show, be sure to subscribe to the Curious Professor podcast wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you'd like to become part of my community of curiosity seekers, be sure to visit my website, thecuriousprofessorpodcast.com, and join Dr. B's Hive. Until next time, always be learning and be curious with Dr. B.